So I can't hear anything. Do I need to use it from my phone? I mean, I've been using my Surface Pro. I haven't done anything differently.
Just make sure that you're hold on for a minute. This is
The time is now 4:55. We're 5 minutes out.
Rahima, check your chat. I sent you a message.
time is now 4:59. We're 1 minute out.
Okay. All right, I think we have enough committee members here to at least start. I think it's 4 of us.
Councilwoman Dixon, can you hear me? This is Rahima.
Yes, I can hear you now.
Good, okay.
All right.
Wendell, did you fix the spotlight so it's not on me? Good, 'cause it's on me, it's not on Dexter.
I think it's, okay. So we will go ahead and get started. Is it fine if we get started, WITN?
Yes, you can start, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Community Development and Urban Planning Committee meeting. This is a joint meeting with the Health, Aging, and Disabilities Committee. So I would, again, this is our first time trying out Zoom with a committee meeting. So bear with us if we have any technical difficulties along the way. I will first start with introductions of our committee members that are at least here that I can see. We have Council President Hanifa Shabazz.
Hello, present.
Nick Congo,
Here.
who's chair of the HAD committee. We also have Councilman Yolanda McCoy.
Here.
Yeah, I think that's it for our council members and council president that's here online. And then council staff, if you can introduce yourself as well.
Rahima Jabarbe.
Mhm. Great.
Marshall Bass Knight, Chief of Staff for City Council.
Andrea Queen, staff.
Perfect. So again, this evening we have 3 agenda items this evening that we will be discussing, starting with our substitute number 1, which is ordinance 20-6, which is to amend chapter 34 of the city code regarding the bed bug extermination and treatment. Council President, do you want to speak to that legislation?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. This ordinance was presented before your committee, and we got some feedback from some different individuals in the industry, and we took those into consideration as well as working with the administration. I would like to now and continue with this extent is to address what we know has been an issue in our community with bed bug infestation. So our goal is to try to address it, to educate our constituents, as well as to put into best practices on how to handle such an infestation and keep it from spreading. So I'd like to turn it over to Jabbar Bey to go further into discussing this substitute ordinance.
Thank you, Madam President. The changes that have been made were so that were to look at some of the issues that were raised not only by members of the public who were representing associations of investor owners and landlords, but also those ideas and some concerns that came from the Department of Licenses and Inspections. So we conferred with and met with Law Assistant Solicitor Taylor, and I believe she's here as well. And the idea has been to make certain that, one, people in our city, regardless of whether or not they are landlords or property managers, definitely those citizens who would be renting or are in apartment dwellings, or also dwellings of more than 2 or 4 or 6 units. It often happens with seniors who are in high rises, as well as people who may be condominium owners. All of those types of dwellings have been taken into consideration. The objective is to make certain that the owners, the property managers, the tenants are aware of their roles and responsibilities and what they should do in case of believing there's an infestation of bed bugs or knowing that there's one. One of the things that we learned is that often many people in our city and state are really not aware of what bed bugs are, what they look like, what the dangers can be. Yet at the same time, as many of us know from articles in various news media, we've had infestations in many of the senior high rises. Our policy and legislative staff and the assistant attorneys for the solicitor's office have met several times with the commissioners of L&I and learned a lot from them about some of the obstacles that they face. So this bill actually does present what the roles and responsibilities are of not only the tenants, it includes housing that's only for one family or one unit, that they're responsible if they become aware of or they're given information from a pest control management company that they have bed bugs, even in a private residence. So it includes the private residences, and it includes dwellings that may have more than 2, 4, 6, 8 units in a building, like a condo, like a senior high rise, like an apartment building. And those have been identified in this substitute ordinance 1. In addition, because of a lack of education, and one of the discussions that we did have with the commissioners from licenses and inspection was the fact that there needs to be an educational brochure not a course, just information that could be posted on the city's website with L&I and also with constituent services, which was a recommendation from L&I. This information exists pretty readily throughout educational materials that are online, as well as some of the pest management services. In fact, when this bill was first introduced to community development urban planning, one of the public members who happens to be a landlord or property owner actually showed us a copy, a brochure of educational and informational information. Part of the reason, a driving reason for developing this legislation was because of the infestations that have been reported and over again in some of our senior high rises. And the fact that in the current code, bed bugs is not specifically identified. So in this ordinance, they are identified as one of the vermin, rodents, roaches, all of that. So we sought to include bed bugs in the description so that it's clear that this is something that both tenants, landlords, and property owners should address. In addition to addressing it, this ordinance also talks about the responsibilities of those three parties. The tenants who live in a dwelling that has more than 2, 4, 6, or 8 units, the property owner, as well as the property manager. And there's timelines put in place so that if someone who is in a dwelling unit either sees a bed bug or sees some evidence of a bed bug, they have to report it in 48 hours to the property owner, property manager, or the owner. So some of the legislation talks about what the tenants are responsible for doing and what the property owners are responsible for doing. And any pest management company that is brought into a unit, whether it's a high rise or a single family residence, has to be a pest management organization or business that actually has been either certified by the state or by the city or by some national association of pest management groups, and they do exist. So there are definitely responsibilities on all three parties, the owner, the tenant, and also the dwelling unit resident. And I do want to add that the educational and informational information is not a training course, it's information that is readily available online through various educational institutions and also from pest management national associations. And part of that education and informational, I don't want to call it a brochure because it can be a brochure or it can be put on social media online on the city's website. We also thought it's important that when a landlord applies for a business license, that's part of the information the landlord should receive so that the landlord or the property manager can actually pass out that educational information to a prospective tenant or to existing tenants so that they know what to look for. They know when they're responsible for reporting something either in their unit or in a public space within the building that they live in, and what the consequences would be if they're not reporting it within a certain amount of time. Because our understanding is that bed bugs can populate really quickly. So the 24 hours, 48 hours is pretty much the maximum if you're trying to keep an infestation from going into other units. Are there any questions? I'm trying to summarize it.
No, that's perfectly fine. Does that work for you, Council President?
Yes, thank you. Yes. Mhm.
I just want to recognize that I saw Councilman Johnson as well as Councilwoman Gray had joined us as well.
Thank you.
Evening.
Yeah. I know the commissioner is here. And I know he had some things that he sent to us also. And I know you alluded to that you guys already met and had conversations about this as well. Council President, are you okay with the commissioner speaking at this time?
I would, thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to see if there's any comments from members of council first, and then we can come to the commissioner.
Okay. Everything. Any questions from council members? And I just saw Councilman Johnson.
Yes. Good evening, everyone. And this is my first time kind of taking a deep dive this afternoon into the legislation. And I know it is very important that we do these protections. I guess my question was for Ms. Jabbar-Bey is about timing. Because I know cities like Philadelphia, you know, there's certain timelines, you know, about reporting, say, you know, more than 365 days after the lease begins. So I want to know, was there any thought about that, or is there still time to put that in there, just so that we don't, I mean, you know, we certainly want to be fair to tenants, but we also have to be fair to landlords.
Right.
And tenants can be carriers. And if it's, you know, they've been in an apartment for 5 years, then that cost shift should be a little bit different. So I just want to know what you thought about that, Ms. Jabbar-Bey.
I think that's important information. And one of the things that we were trying to strive to do was to put, you know, put responsibilities on the tenants as well. And in the code, basically, right now, it's only about hours and days when something should be reported. And what we had done was put into this legislation, this draft, that when a tenant is a prospective tenant and meets with a property owner or property manager, an owner or manager, that the manager should disclose if anything is happening at the time and in the unit that the person might be interested in, or in units in other parts of the building. So I think the 365 days after the lease begins is a good piece to add. And I'd ask the president if she's acceptable of that. And it might not be 365 days, but you brought that up as a timeline that's used in other cities.
Oh, wait a minute.
Yeah, Council President.
Oh, thank you. I wasn't set for my hand to go up.
That's all you're about to comment, so.
Thank you for recognizing me. I agree that in my reading it, and thank you, Councilman Johnson, for that added input. But I guess I'm saying 365, should it be something to the point where, since, are you saying that they want to know if the person just moved in, or I'm not clear on your 365, because some people only have month-to-month lease and some people have 6-month lease. So should we say, you know, that there is a timeline from the time that the person moved in or signed the lease, or
Yes.
Okay, because we can keep renewing the lease every month.
Mm-hmm.
Still the same tenant. So we said, you want language to show that from the time that person moved in, that there has been clear that there was not any infestation, so we can see if that tenant brought the infestation. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, because I think in New York, I think had the same battle. You want to be reasonable, but generally, if it's been more than 1 year or 2 years since a person signed the lease, then at that point, especially bed bugs, they were carried from somewhere else, most likely, unless you can find a source certain in the building. But because of the way bed bugs travel, it's different than rodents. Bed bugs travel on clothing. So that would, again, be the tenant's responsibility. And again, this is just more being fair to landlords. If someone's been there for 5 years and now they have bed bugs, that's more of a tenant issue.
Right, and if I may, Madam Chair, I agree with your input, and thank you very much for that observation. I think we just probably need some language to say, because I want to be careful that we said from the move-in or the sign of the lease, or signing the lease, or the first signature of the release, and not necessarily the renewal of the lease, to take care of those monthly leases or those 6-month leases in that timeline and language.
Correct.
So, Madam Chair, if I could ask, Rahima, do you have, or Councilman Johnson, would you like to give a friendly amendment so that we make note of what your intentions of the amendment is? And
Yes.
exactly where I'm just looking where through the ordinance do we include that?
So I believe it would be a new section 8, just be language that's akin to the provisions of this section are applicable to tenants within 365 days of entering into the lease, or something like that.
Right. We do have language about month to month, as well as, longer leases. So we really have to be very precise about the language that would go in about 300, any amount of days after a tenant has moved in. Because right at present, we do have the month to month as well as longer leases in this legislation.
Yes, but it's more of a provision so that this section wouldn't be applicable after you leave that timeline, that you would again go into just general L&I guidelines. And I think that's more my intent, because I think the issue becomes, yes, you can have a month-to-month tenant, but someone that's been there 3-4 years, the landlord's going to face a lot of that burden because the tenant may have brought bed bugs in from work or school.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Johnson. I saw Councilwoman Gray, saw your hand.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for acknowledging me. I am listening to Councilman Johnson, and I agree with that. But, like he said, bed bugs can be picked up on clothing. And if you go someplace and don't know that there are bed bugs where you are visiting, I know it's your responsibility, you brought them back to your dwelling, but that's sort of punitive. Maybe there should be a shared expenditure for getting rid of them, but I don't think it should be all on the tenant responsibility just because you accidentally brought them into your home. One of my concerns, though, is we had a landlord speak at the last committee meeting. He was talking about how difficult it was to treat bed bugs and also to actually document that they're there. So I'm concerned that we make a specific company or consultant as the ones to determine that there are bed bugs, because as I agree, it needs to be done very quickly, and you need to also have a remedy very quickly. So there needs to be standardization in what will be done if bed bugs are found, and also like who will go out, because I think Commissioner Starkey said that his people don't go into homes that are compromised with bed bugs. So we need somebody that's going to go in, determine there are bed bugs, and have an immediate action to take. And I'd like that in the legislation. And I don't know a company, and I don't know what is currently the most reasonable treatment for bed bugs. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Gray. I just wanted to mention that in the ordinance, it does state several times that a pest management service company, not only would they come out not to just exterminate, they would come out to actually determine if there are bed bugs in a unit or in a public space, and then what the treatment would be. So that is in the ordinance. And at this point, as far as we've learned from law and from the commissioners, there are extermination companies, businesses that have certifications around doing the extermination, well, the investigation and the extermination of bed bugs. And interestingly, we learned that many of our, in the nation, hotels, larger hotels, they're actually extermination and remediation businesses. They've used dogs because they have been trained to actually go into any space and be able to identify bed bugs. And I've understood from our research that's pretty expensive to use the companies that have trained dogs to actually sniff out or identify the presence of bed bugs. So importantly, those businesses that are licensed and certified, they come in to investigate as well as develop the plan for extermination.
Oh, thank you very much, and that's very interesting. But like we're unfortunately seeing with this pandemic, I think immediate action is needed when you find bed bugs because they do spread quickly. So maybe we need to invest in a company that brings the dogs in. I mean, I don't know what really expensive is, but looking at what's happening now, it seems like really shutting an incident or a problem down immediately, sort of regardless of the expense, is the best action. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I also want to recognize that Councilman Turner is also on the line. Yeah. Any other questions from council members regarding this piece of legislation? All right, Councilwoman McCoy.
So, to Madam President, wanted to find out about the friendly amendment that you had suggested. What would it look like now with all of the rest of the information that's actually been given?
Mayor, Madam,
Yes, Council President, I'm sorry.
I need to find raise my hand.
Because somehow you popped off my media screen, so I didn't see your hand. But go ahead, Council President.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I am currently, while we're talking, trying to come up with the exact language and to where that will go. And when we finish hearing everyone's comments, we'll go back to get the exact language and location of where the amendment would go into the ordinance. So I was currently working on it. Any suggestions you may have, you can send. I look forward to the input from everyone. But I think working with Councilman Johnson, if you would also assist in finalizing what exactly your amendment should be or say, and you can present that to the body.
Thank you.
And maybe Commissioner also, when he comments, might have a suggested location. And Law, we have several people.
Law is here.
Law's here. I should have left it up to Law. I apologize.
Yeah.
I can't see everybody that's here.
Yeah, no worries. Yes, they're all here, Council President.
Okay.
I know, Marshall, did you still have a question? Sorry, hand raised.
I'm good, I'm sorry.
You're fine?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so
Madam Chair.
Yep. Okay.
Madam Chair, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I know that the representative, the assistant solicitor from Law is here. And if it would be permissible for the attorney to also help address some of these issues, that would be important.
All right. I can have them come on. I see that Commissioner Starkey is saying he can hear us, but his mic doesn't work. So Assistant Solicitor, if you wanted to come on and make any comments, please feel free to.
Hello, this is Taylor West. I agree and think that Councilman Johnson's idea is important to consider. I am concerned about adding just a general section at the end of the legislation, basically stating that it would not apply to tenants after a certain period of time, because then we have to take into consideration those possibly long-term tenants that might be in a multi-dwelling unit. So they could have gotten bed bugs from another tenant who either just moved in or might have brought them in. And so I think we have to be really specific in where we include it and what we say, so that it's only applying to tenants who have just moved into their dwelling unit, if that makes sense.
No, that makes complete sense.
Yes. Which is why I couldn't figure it out.
I'm about to say that's a,
Because it needs to go in so many different locations. with
Right.
Specific time, so.
Yeah, and more of it is, Madam Chair, this is more, again, us trying to be fair, because bed bug is a serious issue, but I think we have to look at when it happened, because if it's not done in a timely fashion, then it becomes an issue. And I think that could really have severe effects on our landlords. They may not even be willing to rent in the future to certain parties if it's this endless road. So that's all I wanted to put more just succinct timelines on there, so that there's more reporting time, measures in there, so that it's fairer.
Hold on one second. I see somebody else's hand. Councilman Turner.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for recognizing me. I just want to reiterate a point that the law department made, and they spoke about the multi units. I know in the language we have something in there about the time frame of a tenant bringing it into the unit, but what's protecting, if it's say a multi-unit, what's protecting the other unit that didn't bring the bed bugs in? Because as she stated out, that the bed bugs go from one area to the next. So even though your house might not be infested now because you're in an apartment, it will be pushed out of that apartment into yours. So whose responsibility does that fall on? Does that fall on the second unit? Does that fall on the tenant that possibly is not covered through the time frame, or is that going to be covered by the owner?
If I'm understanding your question correctly, as the legislation is currently written, and it's actually consistent with the code presently, if two or more units in a multi-unit dwelling, if two or more of those units are infested, it then becomes the responsibility of the owner to pay for treatment services.
So thank you. That's how I read it as well, and that's problematic. If there's a threshold where the new tenant may have brought it in, and then now that's not on the owner because of the new tenant bringing it in, or even if it's extended. I mean, even if it's to the time where it is the tenant that got in the violation, and now they infestated the other apartments or other units, how does that work? Does now the tenant is at fault for their unit, and then the owner is to now pay for the other units? I think that's where it's going to get sticky.
Thank you, Councilman Turner. Council President.
Thank you, Madam Chair. After hearing and then just reading through even more, I guess this is why I'm having difficulty in trying to even word the amendment or find it where to go, because exactly as I've heard some of my other colleagues speak about, in a multi-unit, how do you determine who or what in a multi-unit dwelling, how would you determine where the bed bug originated from? What could it because it could have came, if it's a 4-unit building and all of them have guests, and one of the guests brought the bug in, how do you know who brought it in to be able to see what time limit to start the count? So I don't know how we could really, justify, or even word it to be able to put a time limit on for when the infestation started, whether somebody new brought it in or outside visitor might have brought it in, or it could have been a long time standing person who had a visitor brought it in, and the infestation showed up inside another person who just moved in. It just seemed like it'd be too kind of complicated. I understand your intent, Councilman Johnson, but I just don't know how we would be able to word that and to be able to, how we would be able to make all that work fit in. I'm still looking for the language so I can see how it does cover all bases, because we can't just think from one perspective. How does it cover all bases? One person in that four unit building might have been there for 5 years, somebody else for 2 years, somebody just moved in, and the person with 5 years had a visitor that brought him a bed bug. How do who's held accountable for it?
Councilman Turner, and then I just want to say, I do see someone with their hands up in the, that's in the public. So I do see yours, and we'll get to you once we finish with council members. Councilman Turner.
Thank you. I just want to agree with Madam President, what she said, and kind of like give us another point to think about. We are writing this law, and I don't want us to go into a gray area where we might be in litigations from a landlord perspective and from a tenant perspective. I definitely agree that this is a great piece of legislation. We need to move this at some capacity into our city to protect our residents and also protect landlords as well. So I want us to kind of think about that piece before we kind of like say this legislation is final, just to make sure that we will be protected as far as legalities of what example that council president just gave. Because if you have say a 10 unit dwelling, how do we know where it came from? If one tenant moved in at this time and they might have brought it in, how can we say with a guarantee that they are the one that brought it in that affected everybody else and not the tenant that's been there at, like you said, as an example, 5 years and they brought a guest there? So how do we do that and then not possibly be in litigation from a tenant or a landlord?
Yeah, I think your concerns are definitely valid. In my opinion, and although, I'm not a professional exterminator, I think most would agree that it's oftentimes because of, how easily bed bugs can spread, it's oftentimes can be difficult to identify the source. With that being said, I think you would use just some circumstantial evidence. Like, for example, if there's a 10 unit building and the landlord or property manager has never received any complaints or notices from an existing tenant of bed bugs, and then a new tenant moves in, and within a certain period of time, they are now reporting bed bugs, that's the type of evidence or support that could be used to determine that it was likely that tenant. Also, that's supported by the provision that provides, if it's only one unit at that time, then it's the tenant's responsibility to cover all extermination fees.
Councilwoman Gray.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This may help to solve the problem. I definitely agree with Madam President. But I was thinking that maybe if the landlord provided a inspection, that his unit was totally bed bug free, a legitimate inspection report, that if bed bugs showed up within 30 days, that it was the tenant's responsibility. I don't know if that would work as a friendly amendment, but that 30 days, as prolific as bed bugs are, if you bring them in, I would think in 30 days, you would know they're there. So that's just a suggestion. But to start from clean, the landlord would have to provide a statement or from a legitimate exterminator that his unit is bed bug free. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Any other questions from council members?
Oh, wait a minute.
How do we do this?
Council President?
Yes.
I can hear you.
I'm almost getting. I do have some tentative language that might work for an amendment that I believe, but it still needs to be it still needs to be reviewed because it's coming from Philadelphia's, who Philadelphia's law that I think could address exactly what it is. Because I do believe that we do need to put something in there to answer a lot of the questions that everyone says, and to be able to demonstrate responsibility of of cost, and who's the responsible party for paying for this. So that was one of the questions I had. So I'm reviewing this and trying to get the language, but I believe something needs to be said to secure what we're trying to do. And maybe we could go while we're still working on this that we could maybe hear from, if there's no other comments from council members, from the commissioner.
Yeah, so the commissioner is still having issues with his microphone. So he's still trying to figure it out. So I asked him to send me what he can. I saw while I'm reading his response, Councilman Congo.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I agree. This is legislation that we do need to address and have something coming from our body. But I think it seems like it's almost impossible to be able to pinpoint where a bed bug infestation originates. So I don't know how we can do that, and still be fair to all the tenants and to the landlords, especially in multi-unit dwellings. We do need to do something, but I guess we need to kind of slow it up a little bit and make sure that we're doing it right, because we can say that, a group of tenants have been in the building for years, and a new person comes in. It may seem like that person has brought them in, but it's not 100% accurate. Those tenants who are already there could have gone to a neighbor's house or to a family member's house and brought the bed bugs back at the same time a new tenant moved in. So I think we need to take our time with this, make sure that we get it right, as other council members have already mentioned. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Councilman Congo. And Commissioner Starkey was saying mostly the unit will be clean because it will be vacant when someone moves in. Bed bugs do not like empty units and won't stay there if there's no source. So we're still trying to work on if we can get his mic working. But that is initially what one of his responses were. Councilman Turner.
Can Commissioner Starkey, could we, if that's the case where they don't live in vacant properties, is there a time frame that if a house is vacant that it won't be bed bugs in that property, that we can say? I don't know if there's a professional that can co-sign that or can sign off on that, and or do we do inspections on these? I don't know how you do it. I mean, this is, but I mean, do we do an inspection after a tenant's in there for, I don't know, whatever the time frame is, to make sure that it's protecting the landlord and it's not the tenant? And I guess that would be for single dwellings rather than getting into multi dwellings. And I don't know if we can actually separate the two when we're talking about legislation. So that's just other thoughts as well.
And Commissioner Starkey was just saying, Councilman Turner, to that, they need a source to live. So I don't know if he's going to write more after that, but that was just the initial response that he sent me. Council President.
Yes, and I'm just trying to think about what everyone is saying is according to some language that Councilman Johnson has stated. If I could take a moment to at least read it so that people can see what I'm hearing or take in consideration. it says, responsible party, A, if tenant notifies landlord in writing within 365 days after the lease commencement date, that tenant found or reasonably suspects a bed bug infestation, or within 180 days of discovery of a bed bug infestation in an adjoining unit in the building, landlord shall be responsible for the cost of the investigation and remediate the infestation. So that goes along with what, Commissioner Starkey is saying, that if the building is empty, 9 times out of 10, there is not any bed bug infestation. But if that person's been in there for a year or even 180 days, that the bed bugs most likely has come from one of the other adjoining units. Hopefully they might have, and therefore the responsibility would be on the landlord, because that other tenant should have reported it as well, based on the stipulations in the ordinance. It also goes on to read, if B, if tenant notifies the landlord writing more than 365 days after the lease commencement date, that tenant found or reasonably suspects a bed bug infestation, landlord shall be responsible for investigating and remediating the infestation, providing that the tenant shall share the responsibility for the reasonable cost thereof. Tenant shall not be responsible to share the cost in connection with properties managed by the Wilmington Housing Authority, or properties for which rent is paid through a government housing subsidiary or voucher program. So that kind of covers, I think, some of the points that council members have made regarding responsibility and the length of time that a person's been in the unit, because it should start off clean and fresh, and points to where the responsibility should or should not be.
Thank you, Council President. And then Commissioner Starkey also said they have to travel on sources like clothes in order to live. Any other questions from council members? Council President.
Well, I was going to ask that if this kind of set what I read, and I send it to that I accept this as a friendly amendment. But I wanted to hear what Ms. Jabbar Bay was going to have some input, and I would love to hear her point before I requested the vote on the amendment.
All right, we got Rahima, and then I see Councilwoman Gray as well. Rahima?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good, great. I think that the points that were raised were very good. And I just want to stipulate that all of the work that was done on this ordinance was to make it equitable to both tenants and to the property owners, the landlords. So anything that can be added that would create even greater equity and not make it a burden on either the tenant or the landlord property owner is important. I do believe that there's language already in this ordinance that talks about the responsibilities of the 3 parties, because in many cases, it's more than one. It's not just the landlord and the tenant. Many of the dwelling units have property managers who are on site and take care of the day-to-day operations. A real issue that we need to try to put into this is an understanding that, again, the education and information that most people have, they don't have about bed bugs. So soft surfaces are not just clothing. Furniture that has soft surfaces can also be where bed bugs are. And we're not only talking about the dwelling units, because we learned from L&I that public spaces, open spaces in a dwelling unit that has 6, 7, 8, 12 units or high rise, there are public spaces where people come in, congregate, have lunches, dinners. They're sitting on chairs that are not just wood. They're sitting on couches. So it's not just clothing. Any soft surface can be where bed bugs are. So we learned from L&I that often those public spaces in a large facility or large dwelling are not inspected. So now that's in the ordinance as well. It's not just the dwelling units. It has to be those public spaces. I'm sorry, you guys, that's my doorbell. Public spaces that have soft materials as well. So I really appreciate all the comments. We'll continue to make this as strong and fair, and I don't even mean that word, make this as strong and protective, along with having responsibilities for all parties involved. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And Councilwoman Gray.
Yes, I have a question. Why are we going with 365 days? I would say 60 days or 30 days if it's a clean environment when people come in, and like was just stated, bed bugs can come in on any type of thing, clothing, anything that has fibers in it. Then within 30 days, you would know if it was infested. Why are we going for 365 days? That seems like a long time to allow somebody not to report that they may have bed bugs. And the other thing is that I know someone that got infested a couple of years ago, and in the process of getting rid of them, they were told that bed bugs are somewhat like fleas, that they can live, the larvae or the eggs can live for a couple of years, like around baseboards and around light fixtures. This family had to take all their baseboards, light fixtures, wash everything in hot water. I mean, they went through an extensive and expensive procedure to get rid of them. So I'm wondering, is it totally true, or am I misinformed that an empty apartment will not have bed bugs? I know it's not friendly for them, but they still could be larvae and eggs in various places. So that's two questions. One, is that information true? And two, why are we going for 365 days and not something like 30 days? Thank you.
Thank you. And Commissioner Starkey was also saying agreed all soft materials do assist with allowing them to travel. Council President.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I understand, Councilwoman Gray, I was reading the language from Philadelphia. That's Philadelphia's timeline. That's what 365 days. I was just reading their language. You're correct. And it is within the body of the legislation that if this is just for that one tenant, there is language in there where it talks about that if it's in one dwelling, that is the responsibility of the tenant. So that if they moved in within 30 days and they got bed bugs and they're the only ones that got bed bugs, then it's their responsibility because that means they came in from them. So almost, the question is, for reassurance purposes, I think we have covered exactly what we're talking about, that in timelines, because in the timeline of when it's notified and whose responsibility, I think we have covered that in our language of this ordinance, because we speak about if it's in one unit, something happens. If it goes to 2 units, if something happens. If something goes to 4 units, if something happened, and then the responsibility is shared based on the number of units and exactly where it kind of originated from. And so to your point, Councilwoman Gray, it was written that if we did go with the amendment, we would go with after 3A1, where it says if a tenant notifies the landlord in writing within 30 days after the lease commencement, that tenant found a reasonable suspect with bed bug infestation, landlord shall be responsible for the cost of investigating and remediating the infestation. And I believe that's already within the legislation. So with that being said, again, I'm going back and forth, and forgive me, because I do understand the importance of what Councilman Johnson is saying, but I also think that as we keep working on it and talk about it, I think we already do have that point covered. If I think that's correct, I think that's the opinion of Mr. Barbet, as well as the law department, that we do have this point covered within that language, and therefore might not need the amendment, especially with all the questions the other council members have had. And with that, With that, I guess, I'd like to get the input with that. Since this amendment is quite confusing and extensive, and we feel confident that it is covered by that particular section that I quoted, and taking the advice of the law, and I would love to hear again from Ms. Jabbar Bey, who did most of the research on it. Do we feel comfortable that the point that Councilman Johnson was trying to emphasize is so covered in the legislation when we speak to, I think section 3AI, kind of, if everyone would go to that part of the ordinance, that it does cover that we do cover that point, and it states for the public, if a tenant notifies the landlord in writing within 30 days after the lease commencement date, that tenant found or reasonably suspects a bed bug infestation, landlord shall be responsible for the cost of investigating and remediating the infestation. Councilman, Ms. Jabbar Bey, I would love to get your input on that point.
Okay.
Rahima, and then I also see Councilman Turner's hand is up too.
Okay. Yes, I thought it was in there, and I also think 30 days is sufficient, and especially given that in the legislation, it does say that the property manager or the owner would also verify to a prospective tenant what has or has not happened concerning bed bugs, and keep records from the extermination companies who come in and look and investigate to see if they need, it's not just, they don't just do bed bugs, but now we're saying bed bugs should be in this, in the code and in the ordinance, because there's not anything in there now about bed bugs, and they're not the same as roaches or insects. So some insects and roaches, okay, rodents, but nothing that says bed bugs. And yet we're having all these bed bug infestations in many parts of our city. So I think it is covered. And I think law could also attest to whether or not it's covered. And I think it's important that the tenant who is prospective, moves in within 30 days, has knowledge, not only about for themselves about what bed bugs look like, what they should do about them, how quickly they should report to the property manager if they suspect bed bugs either in their unit or in a public space within the dwelling building. But they also know that when they're responsible. And that's what this legislation does. It tells us, it tells everyone what their responsibilities are.
Madam Chair, I need to make a correction.
Hold on one second, Council President. I'm trying to, because I see hands raised at the same time.
I just don't want anybody to comment on what I just said because I was wrong.
Okay, what was that, Council President?
This is fun. I misunderstood what law was directing me as what I read to be 3A1. That is not already in, that's the recommended language to put in to cover it. Not it's already there, but that's the recommended language she's stating to be the amendment. That she would suggest that 3AI, if a tenant notifies the landlord in writing within 30 days, that's the recommended language she says that we should put in to address everyone's concerns. I apologize for my misunderstanding.
No problem. Councilman Turner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to get a question of clarity from Council President. Are we speaking of the language that you were referring to that was out of Philadelphia that you wanted to add in, or it's a new amendment that they're suggesting that you already had in front of you?
If I may, Madam Chair?
Madam President.
Yes, sir. I read first Philadelphia's long amendment, and then in conferring with law as to what the amendment should look like and suggested location of it, it's been recommended that it would be placed at 3AI. If a tenant notifies the landlord in writing within 30 days after the lease commencement date, that tenant found or reasonably suspect a bed bug infestation, landlord shall be responsible. That's the recommended amendment, sir, and its location within the ordinance.
Madam Chair, if I could
I
continue.
want to say that. Go ahead, Councilman Turner.
I know Commissioner Starkey's having issues with his microphone, but can we get a message to him? Maybe not get an answer today, but in the near future, are there companies that we can pay to inspect the vacant house to clear them of bed bugs? And also, when we talk about a multi-unit, I think that all of us have been talking about, and we agree to a certain degree. We just don't agree to the amount of the possibility of raising business license. I think that we all said that, but we wanted to know what the raising would go to, such as Councilman Adams spoke about pre-rental inspections of that money going to that. Do we also want to entertain money coming from the business license and putting it into escrow that possibly can aid situations that it might be in the gray area if we don't decide for ourselves, but we just put money in there that might be in the gray area where a tenant may have moved in and now they infected another tenant that's in 2, 3, and 4 units in that same building. So do we? And also, what's the reason that Commissioner Starkey doesn't allow any inspectors to go into a house that might be infested? And is there is it a reason for safety? Well, I know it's safety, but is there anything like if we hired someone just to do that, if we have any bed bugs to be able to check, is that a possibility to add that on to staff if we thought about that?
If I may, I know Commissioner Starkey can't speak. This is Taylor. But some of your questions we have discussed. So as far as whether or not we can pay a pest control professional to come in and inspect the property before a tenant moves in, the answer is yes. You could. I mean, if you pay them, that they'll come and do the inspection. I don't necessarily think that it's a good use of resources, primarily because of the point that Commissioner Starkey made and others, that bed bugs typically aren't present in vacant apartment or vacant dwellings. And that's the reason why we in section 3A just required that owners or property managers just visually inspect the unit for any evidence, because if the apartment is likely to be vacant, a visual inspection would generally be sufficient. So you can observe things, and it says in the proposed legislation, such as egg casings or brownish or blood spotting on linens or things of that nature that could just be observed by the untrained eye. I think that's probably the most reasonable, considering resources for both landlords, if they were the responsible party for paying, and in addition to the city, if they were the ones that would take on that expense. As far as why they do not send in their officers or investigators, and it's just, like you said, safety and public health. I mean, people that are trained to investigate or remediate bed bugs, they have special certifications, special training. And so, as I understand, L&I, there's inspectors or officers are not just specifically trained in bed bugs. And so that's not something that's within their purview. And so for public health reasons, that's not something they would do. And so I know in Commissioner Starkey's email, he mentioned his concern about that provision in the end that basically gives L&I the authority to go in and inspect. And so while we understand that L&I does not inspect for bed bugs, what we were hoping to accomplish with that provision is that L&I, if necessary, could contract with a pest management service who would then have the authority through L&I to go in and perform the services.
Thank you, Taylor.
Can I add something to that, Madam Chair?
Yeah, since we were still on the question, and I'll see Councilman Johnson after that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I see Commissioner Starkey's reply in the chat. So my question would be on those lines of safety, even if, do we know how much an outside company would charge us just to exclusively check for bed bugs? But if we don't do that, how much time does it take for a vacant property? Can we guarantee that if a property's been vacant?
Where'd he go?
Councilman Turner, we can't hear you any longer.
Did everybody hear me?
We can hear you now. You went out for a minute.
Did everybody hear me?
You went out for a minute, so I'm not sure if we heard the last part that you were saying.
Okay, yeah, and would where did I leave off at? Technology.
I know you said the vacant. How much would it cost for someone to come into a vacant property? That was the last.
Got you. Okay, how much would it cost? And how much time? How much time? Can you hear me? How much time does it take for the bed bugs to leave a vacant property? Are we sure that after 30 days, that even if we don't need to go inspect it, are we assured that it can't be bed bugs in there because it's no source of food, as the commissioner said, or any other type of heat that they can lay around? Are we assured that after 30 days they wouldn't be there? And the reason I say that is because we can put an agreement in there from the state level to add that to the leases, with the agreement between tenant and landlord.
Yeah, sure. And just so everybody knows, Commissioner Starkey is in the chat box, chatting back, so that you can see his feedback in there too. Councilman.
Madam Chair, could you read it for the public, please?
So he can hear everyone. But he was saying because they can be contaminated and take the bed bugs to their resident, the volume will be out of control. I don't recommend inspection of units because in most cases probably won't find them present. He's basically, I guess he's saying he can find a cost to conduct an inspection. Councilman Johnson.
Yes, as a follow-up to Council President's proposed amendments, I could live with 30 days. I would like longer, 180, 365. But, again, we could always consider that later. Because I've heard of cases where the person doesn't know right away. Because I know there's 24-hour, 48-hour reporting, but it's a case where sometimes people think it's just a spider or they think it's something else or they don't notice the well. So that's all. I just wanted to add more leeway so that tenants can have access to this rather than saying, well, it's been more than 24 hours. You should have known you can't, you have to pay this. So that's all. I just wanted something more fair. Again, I could live with 30 days, 45 days, maybe. I would like 60 if it's not going to be, 6 months to a year, but just something a little bit more fair for tenants so that we truly know whether it was the tenant or we know if it was the landlord. And I do agree. I know Commissioner Starkey's input, I've heard out there, about like companies like Royal Pest, they can do inspections, but it's typically only on units that are actually have people living there. So I'm fine without the pre-rental inspection because, it's not feasible. I don't think it is a great cost from what I know. So I think, with the amendment, I could certainly live with this, and I think this would be a great first step forward for the city.
Thank you, Councilman Johnson. Next up is Councilwoman McCoy, and then Councilwoman Gray, I see your hand.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So my statement was more so speaking on what Councilman Turner had talked about, the inspection of the vacant. I do understand what you're stating. I guess there are times that we feel like a place may be vacant and people are actually still maybe squatting or whatever, or residing or however that goes. But from what Commissioner Starkey states, that if the place is actually totally free of furniture and soft things like that, we may not need an inspection. But my concern is more so about the vacant apartment that's within a multi-unit. So to me, I'm like, if there was, he did state that he would find out what the cost would be to conduct such an inspection. I think that if there's any inspection, it will probably be an inspection that way. If whatever type of, I don't know, Ms. Rahima stated something about dogs. I've actually heard about the dog sniffing, and they can actually detect whether or not there are bed bugs around. Whatever type of inspection actually takes place within a vacant apartment that's within itself in a larger unit, they maybe also be able to find out whether or not there are bed bugs still within the whole building, rather than just within that one apartment that is actually no longer anyone living in there. So I think that if there's going to be any type of cost, it may be just to that one specific issue, not to do, I think be a waste of doing inspection to just one solo vacant apartment. So that was basically my input.
Okay. Thank you, Councilwoman McCoy. Councilwoman Gray.
Well, I'm back on how long these bed bugs live. I just Googled bed bugs. I mean, Google isn't the Bible, but on every site it states what my personal experience with people who have gotten them is that bed bugs do not live on their host. In other words, they don't live on people. What they do is, and this is a quote from Google, they live in hiding places like mattresses and crevices. So just because the place is empty, and they also say that a bed bug in ideal conditions can live 6 months without a host. In non-ideal conditions, which would be an empty apartment, they can still live for several months hiding out in these crevices. So I really think that if we're going to truly try to stop this situation, we need to have an inspection, even if it's just minimal, but someone to certify that the apartment is free of, I guess it wouldn't have to be minimal if you're going to look for larvae and eggs. The dogs would probably be best, but maybe, I don't know. There needs to be some inspection to determine that the empty unit does not have bed bugs, bed bug larvae, bed bug eggs. And I don't have a problem with 60 days, but I think that if there are still bed bugs there, 30 to 60 days, you'll know it, because then you'll have hosts, people moving in with, as Commissioner Starkey said, soft items. So, thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Councilwoman Gray. Any other council president?
Yes, ma'am. Under responsibility of owners, Section B, it says prior to renting a dwelling unit, a landlord shall disclose to the suspected tenant if an adjacent unit or units they're currently infested with or being treated for bed bugs, and the landlord shall maintain a written record signed by the tenant acknowledging the presence or absence of a bed bug infestation or the treatment thereof in an adjacent unit at the time of entering into the lease or rental agreement. So the owner's responsibility is to tell the tenant, unit B, 3 floors up or across the hall, did have a bed bug, but it was inspected on this day, so that that tenant coming in would know that there was possible bed bugs there, and they did do the treatment. So that if we add this additional piece in, if within 30 days that the person moved in and they are infested with bed bugs, there is a record of what they already exist in the building, they might have come from another dwelling, or whether or not that person brought it in. I think if we look at this comprehensively, and I feel confident that staff and the law department and our researchers have maybe looked at all the corners and all lift up all the rugs and to make sure that we've not only protected the tenant, but we also protected the landlords. Because we do know that a person can bring them on their person when they come in, but we also want to, and we also put provisions in there to protect the tenant, that when they come in, they're not coming into an infested property. So I think with that additional piece that we added in, that within 30 days, if that person sees that, and maybe, okay, now I hear when we talk about an additional 30 days, the 30 days is not sufficient per count. No, I hear what you're saying, Councilwoman Gray. Maybe we need to, and Councilman Johnson, that maybe we need to tweak it out to within 45 to 60 days that the person has moved in, got themselves settled because they're moving things around. And then all of a sudden they see this signs of an infestation. Do they, whose responsibility is to address that possible infestation?
Mhm.
So
And
I would like to say, Madam Chair, that in that amendment that I proposed for 3A1, that we would change it to within, I think they just to be comfortable based on research from Councilwoman Gray and from Councilman Johnson, that we move it to within 60 days after the lease commencement. And so I'd like to propose that friendly amendment and as given by Councilman Johnson, and hope for a second.
I'll second it.
all those in favor of the amendment, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Madam Chair, if I can comment on that really quickly.
Yep.
I just have a somewhat of a concern, and it might it might not be one, but just the landlord tenant code, and so Delaware code, it speaks to tenant obligations and landlord obligations, and so the landlord's obligation is to provide a rental unit that doesn't endanger the health, welfare, or safety of the tenant's unit. But then it's the tenant's responsibility to maintain. And so the only thing that I'm concerned about is that as you extend that timeline, you are now, it's getting a little gray whether or not it's it should go under whether the landlord is providing a safe and healthy unit, and so that therefore it's a landlord's responsibility, or then whether it's the tenant's responsibility to maintain. I just think that the providing of the unit, that speaks to the beginning of the term, and is not intended to extend too far into the rental term.
So may I respond, Madam Chair?
And I saw Councilwoman Gray's hand too. Go ahead, Council President.
Ms. West, are you stating that the amendment is now conflicting with the landlord tenant law? And that and if that's the case, as a person who was intimately involved with this, but do you feel that we already have appropriate language that would protect a tenant and a landlord in the case that a person moved into a unit and within and we're infected by a bed bug infestation, met all of the other variables that we've put in there based on the number of units, the time they moved in, whether inspection was done, that all parties are protected. And if you feel that way, then I will withdraw my amendment and move the legislation as presented. Because I don't want to conflict.
I do. I think that the legislation does protect both parties, and specifically tenants who move into a unit that might have been infested. I do think, though, that your initial amendment with the 30 days is kind of in a safe zone, as far as it's still relatively new into the rental term, where it could be reasonably considered to be the landlord's responsibility of providing a healthy dwelling. And thus making, yeah. So if that answers your question, I think your initial amendment was sufficient to accomplish everybody's concerns.
With that, Madam Chair, if I may, I am going by the advice of the law department and our research team who has worked diligently on this legislation, and revert back to my original amendment of the 30 days as proposed.
Councilwoman Gray.
Yes, I have no problem with 30 days. I just thought 365 was too long. But didn't you say that we had someone from the public that wanted to speak?
Yes. We
Well,
haven't.
before,
Mhm.
pardon me?
No, we just haven't gotten to that portion yet, but yes.
But I was going to suggest that we get all input and information before we go with the amendment. I mean, I don't have a problem with the amendment, but, you know, the public may bring up something else that we need to put into the amendment. So I was just going to ask for public comment before we take a vote on the amendment, if that's okay.
Yep. Hold on 1 second. Councilman Johnson.
And I just wanted to briefly follow up the comments from the law department. I do understand that concern. You know, I think 60 or 90 days would still be good, but I understand that. I have no problem with 30. I just want some period so that tenants don't, you know, carry the full weight of this.
Okay. Thank you, Councilman Johnson. Council President, do you want to go back to your amendment?
Yes, ma'am. I like to go back to my friendly, the acceptance of my friendly amendment with the amendment that it stays at 30 days. And hope that the second still stands and we can call for the vote and then we could go to the public.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? All right, abstaining? All right. Leave at this point I heard more ayes than nothing else, so I'm going to say that the amendment is accepted.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
And Madam Chair, I'd like to be added as a co-sponsor as well.
So noted. Thank you. All right. If there are no other questions from council members, I will go to the public next. All right. And thank you so much for your patience, Frank. You have had your hand up for a while, so thank you. Please feel free to speak. Frank? All right. Frank, are you still there? Okay, you went back on mute. Frank, can you hear us? His mic is open, but I don't know if he. I feel bad leaving because he had his hand up for so long. Okay. I am going to. I don't know if he.
It says they can't hear you.
Yeah, I saw Commissioner Starkey sending something to him too. If he comes back on, then I will unmute him again. All right. All right, so I will for now bring it back to our side. Any other, did you want to close out the discussion, Council President?
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you very much. Thank you, council members, for your vigorous conversation and helping us to work through this legislation. I feel in everyone's comments that we all understand this issue with bed bugs, this issue in our city, and thinking this legislation would help us to address that equitably across the lines for the tenants as well as for our landlords is very important. I also want to thank our research team and the law department for their constant diligence into making this into a piece that is addresses the issue, causes no harm, but also just addresses an issue that we know our neighborhood has been plagued with. So with that, Madam Chair, I will like to make a motion to move ordinance number, ordinance number, ordinance substitute number 1, ordinance 20-006 out of committee for the full, to be heard by the full body at the April 2nd meeting.
Is there a second?
Second.
Councilman Johnson, second. All those in favor? Say aye.
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 All right, opposed? And non-voting. All right, this substitute number 1 to ordinance 20-6 has been voted out of committee.
As amended.
As amended. Is there a date? And Marshall, I see your hand.
Yes, I just wanted to mention to the council persons that there will be a fillable committee report that will be sent out to all of you today, since we're meeting virtual.
Thank you, Marshall. Is there a date when this will go on the agenda or no?
April the 2nd.
April 2nd. Okay, so this will be been voted out of committee and will be on the full council meeting on April 2nd.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. All right. Our next agenda item is a resolution supporting the Delaware Senate Bill 192 that expands the definition of race to include protections for natural and protective hairstyles. What we've been seeing across the nation is that individuals have been criticized or have been asked to change their hairstyles based on could be their workplace or where they work, to sports that some of our young people have been doing over a period of time. So for example, we saw in New Jersey that it came up as a case where one of the young men who was wrestling was asked to cut off his locks in order to continue wrestling. We also seen that in other places like California has started to enact the Crown Act, which expands the definition of race in the Fair Employment and Housing Act, where it protects the workplace environment as well as K through 12 public and charter schools regarding making sure that that race definition is included, and that we are not penalizing individuals for having natural hair, and that also in the city of Wilmington alone, that because of our we have over 60% of our population that has that are people of color, that could have a great impact on our city, that we wanted to make sure that hair discrimination is not happening in the workplace, schools, or any form of discrimination is happening to any of the Delawareans that live in, that are here, and that we're simply asking the Senate Bill 192 to include race and protective style to be expanded, and that we make race clear, that it includes historically associated with race, the hair texture, the protective style such as braids, locks, and twists, that this has a direct impact on Delaware. There has been nationally now 23 states that have enacted a resolution in this form. Council President.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For one who has worn her hair natural for over 35 years, and when even in my corporate days, I wore my hair in a natural hairstyle, and now in my professional and public arena worn it, it makes you look back on things that happened during my time when I was donning my beautiful crown, that were those some of the actions considered to be discriminatory, but they just didn't attribute to my hair. But the freedom to be able to wear what God gave me without having to have any other type of enhancement to it, other than just good old shampoo and water, I think should be everyone's privilege and freedom to be able to do so. I know there's a certain decorum and appearance and maintenance of your hair that should fit into the marketplace. I understand that as well, but the freedom to be able to do so and express one's own character, I think should be a given right and freedom. So of course, I would definitely love to be a co-sponsor on this legislation and support it wholeheartedly.
Well, thank you, Council President. Any other questions from council members? Councilman Johnson.
As a follow-up, again, this is a beautiful piece of legislation. Thank you very much, Chairwoman. And my only question was whether it applies to the high school sports authorities, similar to what we've seen in New Jersey, because obviously that's where I think a lot of discrimination will happen on the football field, the wrestling mat, and so forth.
So, Councilman Johnson, it does include schools inside the legislation currently. It doesn't say sports particularly, but it does include workplace and schools.
Should apply to schools. Okay, great, excellent.
Any other council members have any questions? Councilwoman McCoy.
Thank you. I'm like, I was looking for my button. Yes, I think this is actually a great piece of legislation, and I've seen many times as of late it being talked about on the media, social and television. And so I would also like to be added as a co-sponsor to this resolution.
Thank you, Councilman McCoy. So noted, we'll make sure you're added, as well as Council President. Any other questions or comments from council members?
Councilwoman Gray, raise your hand.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just wait.
I found my hand button, but now it disappeared. So anyway, sorry. I just want to say I think this is very important legislation also, because when I was doing truancy court, frequently the reason males and females, but especially males, were not attending school because of being teased about their hair, either lack of a current style or the way it was being kept. It was a really important thing to young males, and they wouldn't go to school because of this. So I think acceptance of your decision on how to express yourself is very important, even in your hairstyle. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Gray. And I know also there's women who also have gone to job interviews or things that know that they haven't been hired based off of their natural hairstyles also. And also have to think about, I need to make sure that I straighten my hair out in order for me to get this job opportunity. And that those things have to happen in order for them to get hired. So those things should not happen. So I thank you all for signing on to it. This important issue that's, like Councilman McCoy said, is even being talked about on CNN a lot, as well as newspaper articles across different states who've had the same issues and we're hoping that as things move along, that we wouldn't have those issues here in Delaware either. So If I don't see any other hands from council members, are there any comments from the public? All right. Seeing no comments from the public. This is a resolution and does not have to be voted out of committee, but this will also be on the April 2nd agenda as well. And our last agenda item for this evening, I'm just going scrolling back up, is a resolution supporting Delaware House Bill 263 as it relates to insulin prescriptions. Councilwoman McCoy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm sorry, I thought you were going to change over who was speaking. So this is actually something that it was brought to my attention, pretty much just reading the paper, and I realized what was actually going on downstate for us. House Bill 263, which actually passed on the House side, and now it's actually going to be going to the Senate side, and they're going to be doing a committee, whatever. It's going to be going to the Senate Health and Social Services Committee soon. And what this bill actually talks about is a cap for insulin. Even though this is basically just dealing with our state employees and what they're paying for their insurance, to me, this is something that actually needs to start somewhere. And I was very happy to read this information. And then when I spoke about it and talked to our staff, it said, I definitely want to support this because I myself personally have known 2 people who are no longer here from rationing insulin. And this is one happened very long ago, and then one happened maybe about a year ago. And so since 2000, so this is more information I did not realize. Since 2002 to 2013, the United States of the insulin cost for diabetic patients has almost tripled in that time frame. You know, and they're paying now so much for life-saving medicine. You know, this is not something that you could skip like, oh, I forgot to take my blood pressure pill today. But these are this is life-saving efforts, and people are not, aren't able to afford it all the time. And so even though this is for our state employees, which may not have that issue at this very moment, to me, this is the first step. And I'm very pleased that our senators and representatives from the city of Wilmington are backing this. You know, Senator Brown, Representative Dorsey Walker, you know, Representative Chiwocha, Bolden, Brady. So with the city of Wilmington having such a large African-American population, and it is primarily with our group that has the issue with diabetes, you know, it just makes me feel good that they're pushing to make certain that this comes about. So this resolution is basically just to state that I am a strong supporter of it. I really do hope that my council colleagues see exactly, you know, the reason why I'm so strongly for it. I praise God that this is not an issue for me, but it's still something that happens within my family. And I just wanted to make certain that people have understanding that this is not the first type of medicine that is something that's life-saving that people cannot afford, but this is the one that they're tackling at this moment, and I definitely want to support it.
Thank you, Councilwoman McCoy. Council President.
Oh, okay. I didn't hear my name, but thank you, Madam Chair. I agree with this resolution and would like to be added as a co-sponsor. And if I'm reading this correctly, we're saying that they want to cap it to where a person is paying $100 a month for insulin, which is $1,200 a year. Yes. For just for the one drug. 9 times out of 10, if you're taking insulin, you're taking several other medications along with it. So this is like one of approximately 4 to 5 medications a person who has diabetes has to take. So even the $100 a month cap is still a big piece. and let me understand, so the $100 a month is what the employee pays after insurance?
Yes,
Or that's after insurance?
yes.
Hmm,
This is the out of pocket.
praise be to, we have great insurance here. City of Wilmington, this is amazing. Yes, I definitely would love to be a co-sponsor on this, and we must keep our eye on this because I know this is affecting many people within our community, especially since African Americans are the ones most affected by diabetes. Thank you, Councilwoman McCoy, for bringing forth this resolution. And again, I'd like to be a sponsor, support it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. Now, Councilman Johnson.
So thank you very much, Chairwoman. Yeah, I do also have obviously many family members. I've even seen on the employee side, employees who have been hurt by this. Because Delaware's healthcare market is one of the not one of the best in the country, and especially nonprofits. I know one in which I'm on the board of. Many employees struggle with healthcare costs, and it's something that I really hope we can pass at the state level, and it can get funded, because that's going to be a big piece too. This is going to have to be funded. The insurance industry is going to have to give up something. So I'm certainly supportive of this. This is very important to African American community. And I would like to be added as a co-sponsor and help this get through Dover. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Johnson. Council President.
Yeah, just one other thing too. Understanding that this is an issue that's high, it's just plaguing our community, and not only just in health wise, but also now seeing the economic impact that it has on our community. Hopefully we can encourage, and I'm speaking for self as well, anybody else's effects, encourage us to do better in self-care, because we do know that some forms of diabetes are treatable by other alternative lifestyle changes, dieting, exercise. And if it's going to impact us this way financially, and I'm singing to the choir here, it's going to impact us financially, that we really need to encourage our citizens and self to do what's necessary to help fight this disease, because it is something that can be, in some instances, type 2 can be reversed, that we maybe start an initiative that encourage and support our citizens to address this through other means rather than have to pay this $100 a month. I just wanted to make that, commentary.
Thank you, Madam President. And I'll speak to that. So my father also has diabetes. But he was able to reverse it. So now he doesn't have to do insulin. And have to pay out that cost to do that. But I also have other family members who have diabetes also, who have to pay that charge. And like you said, $100 is a lot for a person to pay for just one medication for, in addition to whatever else they may be paying for prescriptions. So I definitely also would like to be added as a co-sponsor as well. And a lot of the parts of the city of Wilmington has very high rates of diabetes, just here in the city of Wilmington. So a lot of the areas that we went into when I was a health outreach worker, that was many of the things that you would find is diabetes and hypertension, but the highest two that are amongst African Americans here in the city of Wilmington. Councilwoman McCoy.
Thank you.